Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and here we are again. I'm gonna give you my heads up that I always do. Remember, I have exotic birds, so if you hear that, and I don't know how much the microphone is picking it up, that's because it's very cold here, and normally where I keep my birds outside on a porch, too cold for that. So they're all in here, and of course they need to make their presence known. So yes, if you hear some unusual noise in the background, it's not anything eerie, it's just my birds. But anyway, let's get off to the first story out of Stranger Than Fiction stories. And this has to do with a hotel which has been around for a long time. And it's gotten an eerie reputation in modern times, but based on stuff that used to happen there before. Some of them possibly urban myths, but hotels see a lot of drama. Stuff that comes to the public eye and a lot that doesn't. So here it is. This is titled Scary Times at the Skirvin Hotel. In 1910, William Balser Skirvin, a millionaire and real estate developer, built a hotel in America's heartland. In its 100 plus history, it has seen many pass through its doors, so it's not so strange it developed a reputation for being haunted. In the spring of 1910, construction started on the Skirvin Hotel in Oklahoma City. On November 30th, William Henry Proctor was killed by being hit on the head by a falling scaffold while at work. He was a stonemason. A man working at the top of the building accidentally knocked the timber off. 2 weeks later, scaffolding on which 50 men were engaged in laying brick gave way without warning. 2 men were killed, Ray Papard, 33, and Irvin Walter. Others near the men caught hold of hanging timbers or window sills and escaped falling. The 2 men who fell 5 stories landed on a pile of bricks nearly at the exact spot at where Proctor was killed, which was the north side of the building. Ona Papard, his widow, eventually won $12,000 from Skirvin and the construction company, but only after they refused, blaming him for the accident. Eventually, 5 men were killed during the construction of the 10-story hotel before it opened its doors on September 26, 1911. The hotel was designed to cater to upscale guests, and William Skirvin furnished the suites on the ninth floor with the best decor. He occupied the floor with his 3 children, Pearl, Marguerite, and Orrin. His wife Hattie had died in 1908 from pneumonia. Within a month of the hotel's opening, Albert Myers, 20, a bellhop, was killed. He was on the 6th floor attempting to repair the door of the freight elevator. He had stepped out on the beam in the elevator shaft and had his foot braced against the weight attachment. When the bell rang for the elevator, he called out, but the boy in the elevator did not hear him. His foot became caught as the elevator started up from the first floor and as the weight dropped from above, and he was crushed against the side of the shaft. None witnessed the accident. Within 18 months, another death occurred at the Skirvin Hotel. This one was not so inconsequential to Mr. Skirvin, who owned the hotel. Frederick W. Schrubel, 37, managing director of the hotel, shot himself in the head. He had just been complimented by the stockholders for his good management style. However, the reason given for the rash act was an excruciating headache due to his adenoids. No suicide note was found. He shot himself while his wife entertained a group of friends at a social function in the parlor of the hotel. A few minutes before, he had been circulating among the guests and attending a board meeting. Assistant County Attorney Archie Hilpert opened a murder inquiry despite Skirvin's assurances his manager was overworked and suffering from different ailments. Investigators confirmed the gun found in the bathroom was the one that had fired a deadly shot. However, Strubel's face was bruised and he had no gunpowder burns that were usually found with a close range shot. Mabel Ludi, the hotel bookkeeper and Skirvin's secretary, told investigators Strubel had kept a firearm for protection since he was having problems with the hotel's cooks. Dr. T. A. Buchanan testified at the inquiry that adenoids would not have been painful enough to cause a person to take their own life. Despite inconsistencies, investigators could not prove the manager had been murdered, and the death was ruled a suicide. Struble was a member of the Masonic and Elks Lodges and the Oklahoma City Commandery Knights Templar. In full uniform, members of the Blue Lodge, along with friends and relatives, accompanied the line of procession. It was headed by the Masonic band of 21 pieces where proceeded to the First Christian Church. Despite the pomp and circumstance of his funerary entourage, no memorial was erected over Struebel's grave in Fairlawn Cemetery to mark his death in 1913. No further mention was made of Mr. Struebel's strange timing for doing away with himself, or if indeed it was an act of self destruction. In September 1914, less than a year after Struebel killed himself, the sheriff, M.C. Binion, battered down doors at the Skirvin Hotel. He found nearly a barrel of fine wine and 6 barrels of bottled bond whiskey stored in the linen rooms on the ninth floor of the hotel. From rooms on other floors, smaller quantities were found, including from guest rooms. Inside the linen room, police found gambling apparatus, including poker tables. J. F. Hartwell, alleged to be one of the owners of the hotel, along with Jack Medley, a clerk, was arrested. A warrant was issued for Ed Cummings, another stockholder who was out of the city. The charge was conducting a place where intoxicating liquors are sold. Pretty good timing, huh? So, the outcome of the incident was hushed up, which is not surprising considering Skirvin's connections. And that's the thing. Mr. Skirvin was, the parlance, a mover and a shaker. So, it's not surprising. It's almost like he, there were people like in law enforcement that were trying to, you know, rid of this vice stuff. But hey, if you've got connections, you've got connections. So anyway, the next death at the Skirvin Hotel was not an employee but a guest. In July 1918, Rue Mitchell, 23, died unexpectedly. She lived at the Skirvin Hotel with her husband, who was traveling on business. She had complained of a sore throat but died before being operated on. In 1928, Nancy Jones, 43, a former missionary to China, committed suicide by taking poison while staying in one of the rooms in the Skirvin Hotel. She had been in Oklahoma City for 5 months and had plans to find a job as a nurse. For an unknown reason, she told her friends at the boarding house where she was staying that she planned to end it all. She was widowed and had left a postcard with her sister's name, who was married to the city manager. The police started an investigation as to what happened to $1,700 that Nancy had withdrawn from the bank, but it could not be found in the hotel room, and she never mentioned it in the short note she left. Nothing more is written about why she took the money out or where it went. In 1930, 4 more floors were added to the hotel, building over the infamous 10th floor, which had hosted illegal gambling and drinking, including reports of a rigged roulette wheel. There were 525 well appointed rooms, a roof garden, and a cabaret club. It's not unusual for a hotel to host celebrations, but many other events occurred under its roof, and not all of them pleasant or made public. In 1933, Bob Anderson, a well known traveling salesman, died suddenly in his room at the Skirvin Hotel following an attack of acute indigestion. Only a few months later, on July 5, 1933, Charles N. Haskell, Oklahoma's first governor after statehood in 1907, died in his suite at the Skirvin Hotel. He was sick and collapsed in the hotel lobby, drying, dying from pneumonia. He was 70 years old. So as you could see by some of the people that were staying there, like they said, this was not like a regular little hotel. This was like the place to stay at. And yeah, but there's nothing like a guy dropping dead on the in the lobby, right? But anyway, in 1937, George H. William, owner of the Willis Tailoring Company, which had operated in the Skirvin Hotel since 1918, died. He was one of the best tailors in the city. Pneumonia claimed him after 2 months. He was 70 years old. Yeah, he had one of those, one of these hotels where they have shops at the bottom, and tailors back then were it was a big deal. Anyway, in 1938, Skirvin's daughter Pearl filed suit for accounting of her father's Globe Pipeline Corporation and other companies, alleging that her father had transferred irregularly to his own name stock, which she held in the firms. She was joined by her siblings. 2 months later, they settled after meeting in private without any attorneys present. However, this was only a temporary treaty. Surprisingly, Pearl Skirvin Mesta was not short of money. She had married George Mesta, a man 20 years older than her, in 1917. He died in 1925 and left her a fortune of $15 million. Dollars. On March 12, 1944, William Skirvin was thrown into the windshield of a car in which he was riding with a friend. He suffered several broken bones and then pneumonia set in. He died on March 25th at the age of 83. Only 2 weeks before his death, he regained control of his extensive oil and hotel fortune, which was restored to him by federal court decree, including long litigation with members of his family. The best known ghost story of the Skirvin Hotel is tied to Mr. Skirvin. Rumors are that during Prohibition he took up with a maid who worked at the hotel. She became pregnant and he locked her up on the 10th floor, room 1015 to be exact. Someone with his reputation could not have withstood the notoriety of having impregnated one of his own employees. After she had the baby, they kept her locked up. Supposedly one day she jumped out with the baby in her arms. Problem is, there is no story of anyone jumping from the Skirvin Hotel. The ghost was dubbed Effie. Skirvin was a womanizer, and it's not a stretch of the imagination to believe he had a fling with a maid, but none of the Effie story has been verified one way or another. Effie is said to accost men, mostly by touch, but others have claimed to see her in the nude. Sometimes she opts for clothing in the form of a red dress. She has been experienced throughout the hotel. Effie is known for playing pranks on people by knocking on doors, whispering, and opening drawers. During those years, beer parties and gambling took place in the hotel, making it a well visited speakeasy. No doubt the flirtatious ghost nicknamed Effie could have found her origins there. Perhaps a flapper, but not the unfortunate chambermaid if she ever existed. And definitely not Nancy Jones, the missionary nurse who died by ingesting poison. But it's not only Effie's antics which are felt. Others report maid carts pushed down the hall as well as weird noises. There are also reports of hearing a baby cry, which, considering it's a hotel, is not an unusual thing, but then who knows? The Skirvin Hotel and Skirvin Tower were sold to Dan James, a well known hotelier. Throughout the years, he renovated the hotel, but it closed in 1988 due to little occupancy. The building was empty and abandoned for almost 20 years. It reopened in 2007 as the Skirvin Hilton. In 2025, the hotel completed a $22 million renovation. In 2010, Bulls Taj Gibson told of an eerie experience during his stay. Quote, at one point at around 12:15 at night, my bathroom door just slammed completely shut. I don't know what it was, but it just completely slammed. It took me a minute to it out figure out what it was. His teammates at the time reported hearing other odd noises throughout the night in the halls. End quote. That same year, Bill Simmons, a columnist for ESPN, stayed at the hotel and retold the following story. Quote, I woke up at 4:30 with my heart pounding. I swear on Tom Brady's ACLs that the following happened. At first, I heard a baby crying and realized that was why I woke up. I thought it was one of my own kids before remembering that my kids weren't babies anymore. Then, remembering that I was in Oklahoma City, not Los Angeles, suddenly it dawned on me that I wasn't alone. I had an overpowering sensation that someone else was in the room. Until you've experienced that feeling, you can't understand what it's like. Your blood is swishing through your veins at 200 miles per hour, only you don't understand why your body reacts a few seconds before your brain does. The New York Knicks Oklahoma City Center, I'm sorry, in 2016, Justice Winslow, a player for the Miami Heat, said he was taking a shower around 9 a.m. Unexpectedly, the bathroom door moved on its own. He was quoted saying he tried to spend the least amount of time in his room. Gerald Green was the first one to tell Tyler Johnson about the haunting at the Skirvin Hotel. Green said that on a prior visit, he had to share a room with a teammate because of noises they heard throughout the night. Some players have been so spooked they have paid from their own pocket to stay in another hotel. The lobby area is decorated with carvings of Dionysus, a Greek god known as a deity of wine, festivity, fertility, and religious ecstasy. He was known as Bacchus by the Romans. Stephen Lackmeyer, who wrote a book about the Skirvin Hotel, specified that he didn't believe in ghosts but did describe the following eerie event. Quote, but when the Skirvin closed in 1988, a couple of years later, the entire power box was pulled so there could be no danger of fire. No power, no electric going to that building for the next 15 years. I started covering the Skirvin back in the mid 90s, and every time you went in that lobby, right where W.B. Skirvin would sit in his chair, There was one light bulb that always stayed lit. There was no power, and that light stayed lit until the destruction phase started, the renovations and gutting. I saw it. I can't explain that. There's one other tale I'll tell you. Make of it what you want. Before the hotel reopened, we were being given a tour of the finished rooms by one of the owners. We went to the 10th floor, which had been totally sealed and locked down. When you're about to open a new hotel, they don't want construction workers going into these rooms once they've been ready for inspection. We went into the suite. The TV was on, and it was playing the kind of movies that amorous Effie might indulge in. So if you believe in those stories, I imagine how those two might add some interest to that. I'm sure there's an explanation. So, yeah, crazy stuff went on. Maybe stuff that made the papers, stuff that didn't. That you hear noises in a hotel. But the thing about the door slamming and there's no wind, I imagine, because those rooms are closed. Something to think about. A lot of things happened in that Skirvin hotel. And Effie, again, makes me think. That I think that thing about the chambermaid jumping out with a kid, that was urban myth because there's no record of that, like anybody jumping. And but that he might have carried on, yeah. All right. Next story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories is titled "The Lady of the Dunes and the Mysteries Surrounding Her Death." On Halloween 2022, the 48-year-old mystery of the Lady of the Dunes was solved. Her name is Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old native of Tennessee. However, even when cases are solved, there are many questions left unanswered. During the late 1970s and early 80s, serial killer Hayden Clark lived with his maternal grandparents, Maynard Bailey Scranton and Flavia Scranton Nee Bloxam. They were both natives of Meriden, Connecticut. Hayden Clark came from a prominent family. The Scrantons traced their lineage back to the Mayflower, and other members were heroes in America's Revolutionary War. His grandfather served as mayor of White Plains, New York, and his father, Hayden Irving Clark Sr., a chemist, had invented clear clinging plastic wrap and fire retardant carpeting. The family's proper outward appearance masked a deep well of dysfunction. Haddon was the couple's third of four children. His mother, Flavia Clark, was an alcoholic, and when her third child turned out to be another boy, she masked her disappointment by dressing him in girls' clothing and called him Kristen. The four siblings were abused by both parents since the father also suffered from alcoholism and would engage in bouts of domestic violence in front of his children. As an adult, Hayden Clark graduated from the Culinary Institute of America. However, his strange behavior would get him fired from prestigious jobs. His next stop was the Navy, where he served as a cook. In 1985, he received a medical discharge after being diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, manifested by persecutory and grandiose delusions. During the 1980s, Hayden Clark was well known in the homeless community. He lived out of a 1983 Nissan pickup truck and a makeshift camp in the woods. In 1988, a landlord who rented a room to Hayden filed for malicious destruction of property. Hayden had set up a booby trap over a door, sprayed black dye on the carpet, and hid decaying fish heads in the piano, chimney, and stove. He told the landlord about getting even with other people. He had killed the landlord's cats as well. This was something he did as a teenager when he was angry with someone. He would steal their pets and kill them. This was the same year he was charged with assaulting his mother. He pleaded no contest and was put on probation for 1 year, and he had to continue psychiatric care at the VA. In 1989, he dressed as a woman, entered several churches, and stole purses and coats from ladies attending choir practice. Police pulled him over and found the stolen loot in his trunk, along with women wigs, dresses, and cash. He kept telling them, "I'm a woman." It wasn't until 1992 the police realized they had a serial killer on their hands. Clark, dressed up as a woman, broke into Laura Hotling's apartment and killed her by slitting her throat. A bloody fingerprint on a pillowcase and a hair from one of his wigs led to his arrest. He had done gardening for her family. He was arrested, and the 40-year-old confessed to killing women and girls from the mid-1970s to 1993 along the eastern seaboard. Clark said he would dress like a woman and drink their blood. When asked why he drank the women's blood, he said that he thought that if he drank enough of it, he would be transformed into a woman. He told them he wanted to become the victims he had killed. The Montgomery police said that while being questioned, he acted like three different persons. Beside his own identity, he talked like a woman and an infant. The female personality identified as Kristen Bluefin was the one who spoke about burying them in New Jersey. She didn't clarify who them were, sending police to search around his boyhood home of Warren, New Jersey. The search yielded nothing. The investigators realized the more they dealt with Hayden in his bluefin persona, the less information they extracted from him. When asked to draw a picture of Kristen Bluefin, he produced a picture of a blonde woman with blue eyes. Doctors who examined Clark concluded he did suffer from mental illness, but he was manipulative as well. Hayden Clark was sentenced to 60 years in Maryland, and police were still not sure how truthful he was about the women he said he killed, which he claimed was about a dozen. He said that his woman alter ego was the one who committed the murders. In 2000, after agreeing to purchase women's clothing for him, he said he would lead police to the graves of some of his victims in Connecticut. Nothing was found except a bucket with 230 pieces of women's jewelry on his family's property. One of them was Laura Hotling's high school ring. The collection was his trophies. The woods located in the town of Wellfleet, Massachusetts, were part of a 7-acre property once owned by his grandfather, Silas Clark. Though Clark grew up in Pennsylvania, Hayden spent his summers in Wellfleet where he worked in restaurants. Clark also met with authorities in Meriden, Connecticut, where he claimed to have buried another body around 1980 in a family property owned by his maternal grandfather, Maynard Scranton. Although never officially Although never stated officially exactly where the search was made, it was speculated to have been on the grounds of the abandoned Undercliff Hospital. Authorities were willing to follow Clark's goose chase because in 2000 he led them to Michelle Dorr's remains, which were found in a shallow grave in Silver Spring, about 5 miles from her home. She disappeared in 1986. He confessed to killing her after denying he had done it for the previous 7 years. He slit her throat, drank some of her blood, threw her body in a duffel bag, and took it home, where he cannibalized part of the child before burying her. He lived 2 doors down from her father's house with his older brother, Jeffrey Clark, who had allowed him to move in after being discharged from the Navy. After masturbating in front of Jeff's children, he was ordered to leave. A few months before that, he was arrested for shoplifting women's lingerie. The murderous bent in the family didn't just belong to Hayden. In 1984, his older brother Bradfield, a computer software specialist, murdered his co-worker Patricia Mack after banging her head against a brick wall and then strangling her. Patricia was married and he had invited the couple to dinner, but at the last minute Mr. Mack couldn't make it. Bradfield made advances on her which she spurned. He cut her body into 11 pieces in the bathtub with a kitchen knife, cooked her breast on the barbecue grill, and ate it. What was left of her was stuffed into plastic bags and stored in his Datsun 200 SX. He then tried to commit suicide by stabbing himself in the neck, wrist, and abdomen. When the pain became unbearable, he called an ambulance. The police arrived as well, which is when he confessed to them what he had done. In September 1986, Hayden and Bradfield's father killed himself at his daughter Allison's house in Rhode Island. Prior to the suicide, police were questioning his son, Hayden Jr., about the disappearance of 6-year-old Michelle Dorr. That same year, Jeffrey Clark was accused of physically abusing his children in a divorce suit filed by his wife. Remember, Jeffrey Clark is one of his other brothers, the one that told him, "Get out of here, you just masturbate in front of my kids." But apparently, I don't know, that whole family was, woo. After his confession, Hayden Clark was considered a suspect in the 1974 murder of an unidentified woman named the Lady of the Dunes. A young girl walking on Race Point Dunes in Cape Cod found the naked, mutilated body face down on a beach blanket. Her head was almost severed from her neck and was resting on her folded jeans. Her hands were cut off at the wrists. She had long auburn hair in a ponytail, pink toenail polish, and wore blue bandana and Wrangler jeans. Because remember, at this point, the Lady of the Dunes is unidentified. She wasn't identified till recently. So anyway, what killed her was a blow to the head by what police suspected was a military entrenching tool. She had been sexually assaulted with a wooden object, apparently after she was dead. It was thought she had lain there for several weeks. There was no sign of a struggle around the body, leading police to believe she knew her attacker or was killed elsewhere. She had extensive dental work. Dental records were checked all over the world, but there was no match. Her identity remained a mystery despite various theories from different sources. She was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery with a stone marked unidentified female body found Race Point Dunes, and the date July 26, 1974. Her remains were exhumed in 1980, 2000, and 2013 in efforts to identify her with DNA testing. The most well known came from Stephen King's son, who in 2018 said he thought he recognized her as an extra in the background of the movie Jaws, released in 1975. The tie in to Haddon Clark is that he claimed to have buried a woman in a sand dune after chopping off her hands and using her fingers as bait for fishing. Around the time of the murder, he worked in Cape Cod's Provincetown. A copy of a letter and drawing allegedly by Clark depicts a handless, nude woman labeled Summer 1974 along with a map of Cape Cod. Authorities were torn between believing what Hayden Clark claimed as his body count and the suspicion that much of it was produced by his sick mind. Ultimately, he was convicted of the murders of Hodling and Dorr, which landed him in prison for 60 years. Time marched forward, and it wasn't until 2022 that the name Ruth Marie Terry's 37 was given to the Lady of the Dunes. She was identified with the use of DNA analysis and genealogy research. She went by the aliases of Terry Marie Vizina, Terry M. Vizina, and Terry Shannon. Ruth was born in Whitwell, Tennessee to Johnny and Ava Terry, with her mother passing away at age 23 from epilepsy. Terry was only a year old when she died. Ruth married Billy Ray Smith, a Korean War veteran, on October 21, 1956. It's unknown exactly when she left Tennessee and her husband behind. However, in 1958, she gave birth to a baby boy. It's unclear if Billy Ray Smith was the father, but in exchange for financial support, she arranged for her supervisor, Richard Hanchett, and his wife to adopt a child. She worked at the Fisher Body Automotive Plant in Livonia, Michigan, and went by her married name of Ruth Smith. In the 1960s, she lived in California and eventually returned to Tennessee. In 1972, she reached out to her son, who was recovering from a drug overdose that left him in a coma for 18 days. On February 16, 1974, she married Guy Moldavan, using one of her aliases, Terry Marie Vizina, in Reno, Nevada. The couple visited her family in Tennessee and her half-brother in Chattanooga before traveling to Massachusetts. Her family never saw her again. Her grandniece, Brittany Novongloski, recalled that Terry seemed not herself when in the presence of Moldavan, who exhibited possessive behavior. Moldavan returned alone driving her vehicle, telling her relatives they had a fight during her honeymoon and he had not heard from her again. Her nephew, John Randall Terry, said, quote, "My father, while he left in 74, he went to California looking for her, and her husband at that time said she sold everything she had and joined a cult." End quote. Her son, Richard Hanchett, like many adopted children, decided to find his family of origin and in 2018 took a DNA test and met his mother's family in Tennessee. This is when he learned she had been missing since the early 1970s, and her family had been searching for her since then. Guy Rockwell Moldavan was always considered a prime suspect, not only in the death of Ruth Terry, but a previous wife and other unsolved murders from Northern California. Moldavan was an antiques dealer who went by the aliases of Raoul Guy Rockwell and Guy Moldavan Rockwell. He was a tall, handsome man measuring 6 feet 4 inches, and he hailed from New York but grew up in Ribera, New Mexico, where his family ran a cattle ranch. He was well schooled, and before becoming involved with antiques, he had worked as an actor and disc jockey, or so he said. After 1950, he ran an antique store in Seattle with his first wife, Jo Ellen Loop, until 1956, when their 10-year marriage went bust. They had a child together, Towers Rockwell, born in 1949. The reason for the split was Manzanita Hearns, who he met as a customer. Their meeting ended her marriage as well. It seemed Manzanita's days were numbered when her new husband met Eveline Marie Emerson in 1959. Within months of this meeting, Manzanita and her 18-year-old daughter Dolores had vanished. Using this pretext, Moldavan obtained a divorce on the grounds of desertion in July. With divorce papers in hand, he left Seattle and flew to Reno using the name of Michael Strong. On July 29, 1960, Using his alias, he married Evelyn Emerson, a French national who was 5 years older than him. With new wife in tow, he bought an expensive sports car and drove across the country to Provincetown, Massachusetts. He posed as a Vancouver newspaper reporter. His next stop was New York for rhinoplasty to straighten his nose. Once recovered, he drove to Key West and returned to New York for another nose operation. Perhaps it was Moldavan's uncaring behavior or what he told William Mearns, Manzanita's ex-husband, to explain the women's disappearance. But Mearns contacted police in August 1960. He told them he had not heard from either woman since April. Manzanita was usually made a monthly visit to Vancouver to see her two daughters, ages 7 and 13, who lived with him. In the meantime, police found parts of a human body and tissue in a newly sealed septic tank at the Seattle property where Moldavan had lived and run his antique shop from. Other human remains were found in the Columbia River, which was close to the home. It was reported that an upper dental plate and a section of arm bone sawed at both ends was found in the tank. In the autumn of 1960, FBI wanted to question Moldavan in connection with the mysterious disappearance of his second wife and his stepdaughter. He was also wanted on a charge of fraudulently obtaining $10,000 from the stepmother of his third wife, supposedly to buy antiques in Canada. He had disappeared after obtaining the money. Moldavan was found in a Greenwich Village apartment cluttered with art. He had dyed his dark hair red, shaved off his mustache, and was using the name Michael Strong on the apartment's 3 year lease. He was charged with unlawful flight to avoid giving testimony relating to the mutilation of human remains. Moldavan was brought to trial in October 1961 on a charge of grand larceny and testified that a childhood resentment of being a Jew and a foster child led to a life of deception. He admitted to misrepresenting himself in Seattle as a Fulbright scholar, a university graduate, a war hero, and a world traveler. His brother, Michael Moldavan, went through Harvard Law School, where he was engaged as an economist in Russian research. He was also an intelligence officer on the staff of General Douglas MacArthur. A valuable witness for the prosecution was Ronald Gregory, who died in March 1961 from diabetes. He was a friend of Moldavan who helped him compose fictitious letters about his achievements. After Moldavan was arrested, he denied killing his second wife and her daughter, but he hinted that he knew what had happened to them. The problem for the King County District Attorney was that they had no evidence to support a charge of murder. They could not identify the remains found in the septic tank, nor could they verify how she or they died, much less prove who killed her or them. Moldavan's mother, Sylvia, his brother Michael, and his latest wife Evelyn were all in attendance during his trial. In December 1961, he was found guilty of grand larceny, which carried a maximum sentence of 15 years. Right after this, he was charged with first-degree perjury. In February 1962, Moldavan was released on a suspended sentence on a condition he repay his mother-in-law, Louise Emerson, the $10,000 he stole from her. He had been in jail since his arrest in New York. He remarried Evelyn on August 10, 1963, in Los Angeles using his real name of Guy R. Moldavan. In 1972, Guy Moldavan was living in Los Angeles and working in the antiques business. That same year, his mother Sylvia died. She had been born Sylvia Silverblatt in New York to Spaniard parents. By 1930, she was divorced with the surname of Moldavan. Around this time, he divorced Evelyn and met Ruth Terry, the Lady of the Dunes, who was found dead about 3 months after they wed in a civil ceremony on February 16, 1974. He married Phyllis Roper on October 18, 1975 in Los Angeles. Unlike her predecessors, Phyllis remained married to Moldavan and outlived her husband, who died in 2002. Around 1976, Moldavan moved to Chular, California, near Salinas. He went on to work as an executive vice president of a silver store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. He retired in 1985 and worked as a volunteer host at the KAZU radio station in Pacific Grove. It was a 3 hour weekly radio program, Talk to Me, which had developed quite a following. He would take calls from the audience and make commentary on different topics, including the erosion of culture and his belief that killing has become a habit. Oh boy. Moldavan is also a suspect in the murders of Henry Lawrence Baird, aka Red Baird, a 28-year-old truck driver, and Barbara Jo Kelly, a 17-year-old waitress he was dating. The couple was last seen in Humboldt County, California on June 17, 1950. Baird's body was found face down on a beach near Table Bluff on June 18th. He was shot behind the head and was naked except for his shoes and socks. Barbara's clothes were carefully folded and tucked underneath his clothes, with the exception of her stockings and shoes. A wallet containing $20 were with the clothes. Baird's car, with the doors open, was parked just off Highway 101, and his .22 caliber automatic pistol was missing. It was believed Barbara Kelly was kidnapped. She has never been found. When this crime occurred, Moldavan was living with his in-laws and worked as a short-order cook at a restaurant owned by his father-in-law, Jerome Loop. The restaurant was on Baird's route where he delivered bread at. Kelly worked as a waitress at the sweet shop in Fortuna, California, where Baird had once worked as well. According to Joellen Loop's obituary in 2002, Moldavan sang on a radio station in Eureka, Humboldt County between 1947 and 1950. However, there was another suspect in this crime. His name was Gail Patrick Irish. He confessed to killing Kelly, Baird, and Billy Wells Hale in 1963. The 46-year-old had a history of sex offenses and was admitted to California Men's Colony, the state mental hospital, when he made his confession to the hospital chaplain. When he was arrested, he had a large caliber hunting rifle. Similar to Baird's murder, Hale was killed in 1957. He was parked with a woman 6 miles north of Marysville, California, when a stranger walked up to the car and shot him in the head. He tied the woman up and drove 16 miles, then pulled into a private driveway. He threatened the woman with a razor, but the timely arrival of the homeowner allowed her to escape. When Irish made his confession, police were unable to locate her. Irish described where he had found Baird and Kelly in similar circumstances. He ordered them out of the car at gunpoint. Baird was ordered to strip, and then he marched him to the beach where he shot him. He drove Barbara to a logging camp near Crandall, California, shot her in the back, wrapped her body in a blanket, and buried it off a logging road. He was unable to take police to where he buried Kelly. However, the logging road he named did exist, even though it was overgrown in 1963. Police misplaced the hunting rifle they took from him when he was arrested, so they could not compare it to the bullet taken from Baird's body. Irish was never charged with any of the murders due to lack of evidence. In August 2023, prosecutors officially named Guy Moldavan as the killer of Ruth Marie Terry, based on the investigation into her death. But the question begs to be asked, how could Clark so eerily describe what his supposed victim looked like when compared to the body on the beach? See, this is what happens. You know, they think Moldavan did it, but then you have sometimes people that will confess to murder. Sometimes they did it, sometimes they didn't, but they'll confess to it, especially if they've got mental problems. And for those of you watching the video version of this, this is a picture of what Moldavan, I'm sorry, of what Hayden Clark produced that he said in 1974 in the Dunes. So was he the one that killed her? I'm not saying Moldavan maybe didn't kill. Did Moldavan have a fight with his wife and this guy caught up to her in the Dunes, or was he the one that killed her? Again, officially though, he was named as the person that killed her. And let me tell you something. This thing, what happened with this Clark family? You get two brothers who are horrible serial killers. It's like what did they do to these kids? All right, that they turned out to be like, wow. I mean, and then you look in the family. By the way, like they said, both sides of the family they were well connected. The Clark and the Scrantons, and apparently has this on the outside looked very nice, and what was going on behind closed doors. Okay, next story also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories is The Stolen Child. On June 22nd, 1919, in the city of Matanzas, Cuba, a 3-year-old girl, Cecilia del Corte Jaruco, was kidnapped. The police and the press accused sorcerers living in the town of sacrificing her. They were imprisoned. Dr. Armando Carnot, mayor of the city, was accused of working with occult leaders, and crowds rioted in the streets. Many of the slaves brought to Cuba during the 17th and 18th century were from the Congo, such as Old Calabar, Nigeria. They practiced a religion known as Yoruba, which they disguised with saints of the Catholic Church. It was known as Santeria, an offshoot of witchcraft practiced by the African magicians was and is still considered a diabolical practice. The Cuban province of Matanzas represents the largest congregation of this dark practice known as Palo Monte. For many years it was warned that in late June, on the eve of the summer solstice, children should not be left unattended for fear they would be kidnapped and used as a sacrifice by the Paleros. This was also the time of the feast day of St. John the Baptist on June 24th. On Saragossa Street, where four corners joined, known as a crossroad, was said to be the place to deposit all luck, magic, and sorcery, from offerings to chango or mojo bags. On one corner was a First Baptist church established in 1895, and on the other corner was the Torres Funeral Home. And if you think it's coincidental that they used that crossroads where there's a funeral home and a church, I got news for you. That wasn't coincidental. But let's keep going. On July 6, 1919, La Prensa newspaper reported that an arrest had been made in Matanzas of a dark magic practitioner known as Jose Claro. He was accused of killing a young girl named Cecilia. Claro confessed that Jose Galvez, the head of the Brujos de Bolondron, sacrificed the girl in order to cure a relative who was gravely ill. He said he had found the child at the corner of Santa Teresa and Narvaez streets. He ordered his accomplices, Jose Para and another man who was a dishwasher at the Hotel Sevilla, to kidnap her and bring her to his home. Once there, they tied the child on a table. Galvez ordered Claro to sacrifice the child, and he took a large sharp knife with which he stabbed the child on the left side of her chest while she screamed in pain. Then Claro took the knife and opened her from her neck to her pelvis. They withdrew her entrails and intestines, then with a hatchet cracked open her skull and took out her brains. All of these were placed in a tray surrounded by onions, garlic, and sesame. An old woman who took part in the ceremony collected blood in small glass vials. They took the child's blood and bathed their feet. Then they painted their foreheads with the blood. Then, with a single towel which they passed around, they dried their feet and their forehead. The child's heart, entrails, and brain matter were cooked with the seasoning surrounding them on the tray and was served to each of the participants. Each dribbled 4 drops of blood on each plate. This was served to the men by a relative of Claro's mother, Facunda. The sick relative was served with the tongue and the fingers of the child. What was left of the child's corpse was placed in a box with candles and was buried in the yard of Galvez's house, about 15 feet from the door. The police tried to find the remains but were unable to do so, and it was suspected someone came and moved the body. Once the townspeople became aware of what happened, they went to Galvez's house and set it on fire. They didn't allow the firemen to extinguish the flames, and he burned to death inside. Then it became known that during the previous night a man tried to kidnap Anna Rosa's daughter. She took her husband's revolver and shot at the man several times, and he fled. Claro told police that the plans were to sacrifice 7 more children in order to cure those with spiritual ailments. He said that Galvez had already killed 3 children, but he had only been involved with the death of the child Cecilia. The police then apprehended other accomplices named Benito Chacho Oliva, Luis Galvez, Francisco Parra, Marcos Rodriguez, and Ricardo Villegas. For the safety of the prisoners, they were taken to Castillo San Severino, a prison fort built in 1693. This place had its own grim past. Under the tower was a shark hole, where the bodies of victims were thrown in occasionally as food for the sharks that infested the waters. During the 1960s, Fidel Castro and his communist cronies executed many Cubans within its walls. Police Captain Curtis took Jose Claro to where the child was sacrificed, looking for where she was buried. Claro said he couldn't find it because the box was buried at night and he was drunk, as were all that participated in the ceremony. He took police to a farm belonging to Ricardo Villegas. This man had given him and Para the box containing the child's remains. Villegas at first denied the accusation, then admitted to the crime. By the time of the confession, it was after dark, and the search of the box was to resume the next morning. However, what was found was Villegas had hung himself with his belt inside the jail cell in the Castillo de San Severino. Captain Curtis took the testimony of Octavio Antolin Reyes, age 9, who had observed when his uncle, Jose Claro, participated in the child's murder, and later when he buried the child in a section known as Coro de Angeles, or Choir of Angels, in the San Carlos Cemetery where Jose Claro worked as a grave digger. Octavio was the grandson of Facundo Reyes, Jose Claro's mother. In their house also lived a very old woman named Maria de la Cruz Rodriguez, known as La Conga. The child's body was found in the cemetery, and her father, Casimiro Dalcourt, and her mother identified her. Dr. Filomeno Rodriguez and Dr. Antonio Font examined the body and confirmed she had her hands tied. The parietal bone was struck apart, the occipital bone was separated, and the frontal bone was divided. Her tongue, brain, and heart were missing. Captain Curtis held a press release in the cemetery where the child's remains were found. The child had been wrapped in a white camisole that was embroidered with the initials JT and was purported to belong to Josefa Toledo, a relative of Villegas, which was also arrested. She was the one seeking a cure. Then a rumor circulated in the city that the child's sacrifice had served to save the mayor's sister, who was sick, and that the letters embroidered on the robe were not JT but JC, which stood for Juana Carnot. It was believed that it was no coincidence that Benito Chacho Oliva worked in the mayor's stables and Jose Claro looked after his horses. On June 29, 1919, a mob made up of 1,000 persons stormed the prison and two were killed by soldiers. They were Jose Guerra, 23, and Armando Arbelo, 25. Of the 8 prisoners, 5 tried to flee and were killed. The mob waited outside to burn their bodies and did not want them buried in the cemetery. The officials said they would have them buried and did so in a secret place. The mayor, Dr. Armando Carnot, ended up resigning his post that he held since 1916. During this time, the newspaper El Imparcial reported that there had been 17 attempts of child kidnappings by Nañigos, which were considered the practitioners of the darkest African belief systems. On June 29th, in Regla, a suburb of Havana, there was another attempted kidnapping of a girl named Asuncion Leal. The child's father realized the intentions of the Brujo Negro and gave chase. He ran after him until police arrested him and took the Brujo to the police station. A mob formed outside, riled by what had happened in Matanzas. They forced their way in despite being shot at. Soldiers responded to help the police, but the crowd, described as furious, surged forward and overcame any resistance. They took the prisoner, tied him behind a horse, which was whipped into a gallop, and he was dragged until he died. They weren't fooling, were they? In 1929, it was reported that in Havana, a voodoo plot to abduct the toddler for sacrifice was stopped by secret police working at Regla, a small town across the bay from Havana. 14 cult members were arrested and the 2-year-old child saved. She had been seized by several Jamaican Negros Brujos that were acting under the order of their leader who wanted the child's blood to cure a sick woman. In January 2023, a report was issued about the desecration of tombs in the San Carlos Borromeo Cemetery. Bodies were stolen as well as bones, especially the skulls. Other bones were strewn about. The cemetery officials claimed they didn't have sufficient manpower to adequately guard the cemetery. Also, since there is no lighting on the grounds, the guards only stand at the entrance. In December 2025, exiled artist Camila Lobon reported that her family's remains were missing from the general cemetery in Camagüey. Among the missing were the remains of her great uncle, a political prisoner, and her great grandmother and great grandaunt, who were central figures in her family's history. This continues a growing pattern of grave theft and desecration. This is part of a broader crisis affecting cemeteries in provinces such as La Tunas, Sancti Spiritus, Matanzas, and Havana, where reports include exposed remains, stolen bones, destroyed vaults, and even the theft of tombstones. It's believed the theft of the corpses and the bones are for religious practices, and the resale of marble and metal tombstones on the black market. And what that tells you is this thing that happened where they stole the kid and they sacrificed her and everything, this was 100 years ago. And this thing of the desecration of tombs, let me tell you something. Nobody in Cuba for many years is buried with any type of valuables. There's nothing that they have on them that you could say, oh, they're opening up these graves so that they can take jewelry or precious. Nobody's buried with anything there. Okay, so the fact that they're desecrating these graves, that tells you that there's still a lot of dark magic going on over there. Very dark. When you're talking human sacrifice and animal sacrifice, but most importantly, human sacrifice, we're talking as dark as it gets there. And I don't care what country it's from. Okay, next article is from Popular Mechanics. And This is titled They Thought They Were Doing a Home Renovation, Not an Exorcism. The House Had Other Ideas. All right. They reissued this article, which first appeared in 2021. We walked into the house for the first time on an impeccable autumn afternoon, the kind where the light takes on the hue of burnished gold. It was October of 2009, and we were looking at homes in a small, appealing town in Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley. The place had been staged for our visit, of course, but the red and burnt yellow leaves falling from an old maple tree in the backyard twirled and waltzed with an unpremeditated perfection. There was a huge hearth and a brick patio and 7-foot cedar fence surrounding the yard, which at almost an acre was massive for a house in town. Anne and I took this in through two enormous living room windows, like twin IMAX screens projecting visions of some impossibly idyllic domestic life. The house itself had a heft and audacity that was striking. Built in 1955, the four-bedroom ranch-style home sprawled out and up over 3,000 square feet, a funky amalgam of slabs and angles and cantilevered windows. The kitchen, though filled with dated appliances, was roomy and warm, a potential nexus of conversation and aromatic meals. The vast basement was segmented into 5 rooms. One of them housed a billiards table and featured the word pool in raised lettering on the door. The only other home we'd owned had been a creaky 1800s farmhouse that had seemed to tilt in the wind. By contrast, this was a fortress. On the way out, we stopped by the windows. There's no way we can afford this, Anne said, but it would be such a cool place to have a party. Afterward, we shook off the spell. It was impractical, too big for a family of 3, but a few weeks later the price dropped, and we asked for another look and began a series of what ifs and yeah, but if we did this, we would need to replace at least part of the roof. The furnace was ancient, and the upstairs. What was the deal with the upstairs? It was seemingly once a button-on in-law apartment, but it was now gutted down to the studs and subfloor. And yet the house was so big we could rent out the second floor, which would cover some cost. And what if the roof really wasn't so bad? What if the furnace held out for a winter or two? All we knew for sure was that we wanted to live in that house. Years later, I remembered that I had tried to talk Anne into it, and she recalls fervently telling me on the side, maybe both recollections are true. No, I'm sorry, he said, years later, remember that I had tried to talk Anne into it, and she recalls fervently selling me on the idea. Yeah, so who talked who into the idea, right? The inevitable gut check moment followed. Our inspector filled the binder with notations that, in the restrained language of his vocation, suggest that we face some headaches. The seller appeared to have surrendered over the years to a series of systemic complications. Guys, our real estate agent cautioned, this place is cool, but there's a lot of work here. I don't want you to never be able to go on vacation. We listened to all of this and heard none of it. Individually and as a couple, we tended to absorb the conventions of adulthood solely so we could flout them. We quit jobs to travel, embarked on challenging self guided adventures. We eloped in Western Canada. Sure, I was a writer who possessed a few home improvement skills, but Anne liked that sort of thing. The risk was part of the appeal. The day we closed on 777 Pine Street, we showed friends the empty, echoey upstairs. There were grooves in the floor where walls once stood. A forlorn, half torn out section of red carpet was the only sign that anyone had ever lived there, except that when you looked closer, there were some curious features. A ladder led up a false chimney. At the top was a submarine style hatch from which it was impossible to poke your head out. During the inspection, we discovered a secret compartment, a section of shelving that opened on a hidden hinge when you pressed on it, like something out of a pre CGI James Bond movie. A series of miniature doors fed into a crawl space that encircled the apartment, and the passageway led past a carpeted room, 4 feet high and 8 feet deep, with a chain operated light bulb and a deadbolt that could be locked from the inside. We called it the panic room. It was overwhelming. Our friend Diana commented jokingly, if this were my house, I'd be on anti anxiety medication. We nodded and smiled and maybe cringed a tiny bit, but the truth was we had no idea. Before the elephants and the 3-ton rhino and the lion and Cape Buffalo, a 5-year-old boy stalked rabbits in the farm fields of eastern Pennsylvania. It was the mid 1930s, the country only beginning to shrug off the malaise of the Great Depression. The boy used a hickory limb and a piece of binder twine for a bow and stiff metal weeds for arrows. Though he was a torrent of kinetic energy, Bob Swinehart also possessed a dreamy quality. He loved to draw and escaped into elaborate fantasies that sprung from Robin Hood movies and cowboy and Indian TV shows. When he saw a movie about Howard Hill, the world's greatest archer, Bob instantly identified the man as his hero. Roaming the nearby woods, he imagined he was Hill standing among Africa's massive creatures and exotic landscapes. On Bob's 12th birthday, his parents gave him his first real bow, a Ben Pearson Lemonwood longbow. He practiced through his adolescence before heading to college, where he majored in art. He served in the Army during the Korean War, where he later wrote his thoughts often drifted back to college art projects, high school sports, his oil paintings, and early days with bow and arrows. He said little publicly or to family about his wartime years. Just before heading overseas, he married June Hauser. Bob's father-in-law owned a booming construction company in the Lehigh Valley, an area located at the intersection of God and money. Amish buggies sharing roads with traffic flowing to and from one of the world's largest steel producers. Bob found his way back to archery, becoming president of the archery club of the local Fish and Game Association. Over time, he discovered a preternatural talent. He could hit repeated bullseyes, and when that was no longer a challenge, he would recruit friends to flip silver dollars in the air. In a fluid, blur-fast motion, he would raise his bow and fire, a loud ping indicating a hit. He even learned to shoot the bow accurately with his feet. Bob had a round face and wore his hair in a modest pompadour that conveyed a striking resemblance to Elvis. He was compact, 5 feet 10 inches, 170 pounds, and prodigiously strong, but his face looked round and soft, like owing to his obsession with pretzels. He claimed to have eaten a pound on average every day since birth. He was also an avid Coke drinker. In 1959, Bob arranged through the Fish and Game Association to host Howard Hill at an exhibition at the local high school. Hill stayed with the Swineharts for a time, one of the highlights of young Bob's life. They talked extensively about archery, and Swinehart began to ramp up his own aspirations. A year later, he stalked a 200-pound black bear in Canada, and although he needed 6 arrows to finish off his quarry, one of which missed and embedded in a tree, the hunt triggered his first wave of notoriety. Bow Hunting magazine named him one of the nation's top woodsmen bow hunters, and a local newspaper headlined a story, Shades of Robin Hood, noting that the feat is believed to be the first of its type ever accomplished by a Lehigh Valley sportsman. It ended with a rhetorical twist. Could be Swinehart is another Howard Hill. Bob cautiously says time will tell. Swinehart, in fact, did nothing to discourage such comparisons. He soon began writing his own bombastic recollections of his experiences, pushing both his risk-taking and his turgid prose to new levels. I do not look upon facing a dangerous beast as an act of bravery, he wrote. I simply do not feel fear in these situations. He and June would have 4 children, but even as he deepened his roots, he spent increasing amounts of time hunting. The heads of his prey, preserved by taxidermy, became trophy pieces in the trophy room they built. As the 1960s unfolded, Swinehart, fully in the prime of his life, turned his attention to filling his walls and shelves with even more impressive specimens. And he knew from his hero Howard Hill and from his childhood daydreams that there was only one piece where he could fully cement his own legend. One weekend morning, 3 months after we bought the house, our son Vaughn came into the bedroom and tapped me on the shoulder. He was 5, a tumble of red hair splayed around wide eyes. Dad, he said. Dad, something happened in the living room. It's wet. I rolled over, blinking groggy. Did you spill something? Just get a towel, buddy. Dad, it wasn't me, he said, bouncing softly at the bedside. Some water came through the ceiling. My eyes snapped open. We had just experienced several days of spring monsoon weather, and perhaps not unrelated. Anne and I had been up on the flat part of the roof, which we knew was near the end of its lifespan. We looked at the patch. We took up the patches up there, trying to guess whether we might wait another year in our attempt to triage the most pressing issues. I trailed Vaughn into the hall, still in my boxers. We turned the corner, and there, on the living room floor, a pile of wet debris marinated in a gray puddle. I looked up. A chunk of ceiling, roughly the footprint of a compact car, had caved in. A gentle stream trickled from the maw. We stood there for what felt like a long time. Vaughn looked back and forth from the wreckage to me. During the brief time we had lived in the house, we had continually We'd continually run into people who shared stories about it. They'd visited once or heard local gossip. The mythology dated back to the man who'd built it in the 50s, an eccentric bow hunter. Fences were rare in town, but this house was surrounded by a high cedar enclosure that imposed a distinct sense of remove. Neighbors had noted a camera based security system and remote controlled gate in the driveway, both unheard of in these parts. What was all the privacy about? The seller's real estate agent, who had grown up in town, reported a rumor of a secret tunnel from the basement to the street. Some of it, the tunnel for example, was clearly urban legend, but we found camera mounts around the house and wiring and shelving for monitors upstairs. We couldn't explain the chimney lookout, or the panic room, or some of the other features. The stories were an engaging distraction from all the work paint and new flooring and tearing out wallpaper and old carpeting. Anne took charge as a fearless renovator. I attributed her DIY ethic to her Irish farmer lineage, and I helped with unskilled labor. The experience fit our lives together as a pointedly unconventional couple. Early in our romance, we had alternated adventures on bikes in places like Chile, with shoestring self employment in a tiny New York apartment. We avoided office job and predictability. Health insurance seemed like a pointless frivolity. Having a child changed things. I took a full time job as a magazine editor, but we still thought of ourselves as resourceful and unorthodox and unafraid of hard work. And most of all, we were a team. Pine Street was in a certain way a natural extension of our live first, ask questions later ethos. Maybe it would be the place we lived the rest of our lives. I thought so. Yes, it was daunting, but nothing we couldn't handle. Or could we? As Vaughn and I stood frozen in place, another chunk of ceiling snapped loose and landed with a thwomp. Water trickled in a little faster, and particles of what I guess was loose insulation swirled in the air. It reminded me of scenes in war movies, when, right after a bombing, dusk hovers over the rubble in solemn downlight, the imagery both serenely beautiful and terrifying. I wondered what I should do. I also wondered for the first time what we had done. Bob Swinehart was eager. He was in Angola under a fierce sun on a 100-degree day. It was June 1966. He was stalking a creature he dreamed of since his childhood, a rhinoceros with a horn that measured over 2 feet, a majestic animal that weighed thousands of pounds. Swinehart and his guide and crew had been tracking it for hours over countless miles, a bubble wrap of blisters forming on his feet. But he still hadn't seen the rhino because it was traveling under the cover of thick, thorny vegetation, and his guide, Rue Almeida, kept him third in line for his safety behind scouts with rifles. They stopped to confer. Look, this third man stuff is no good with bow and arrows, Swinehart told Almeida, according to an article he later published. Too dangerous, Almeida replied. Maybe so, but necessary if I'm to get an arrow into this rhino. No archer had ever killed a rhino. It was considered too risky. The animal was a battle wagon on 4 legs, as Swinehart put it. A rhino could gore and trample a man as easily as a person crushes a spider. 2 years earlier, a rhino had charged after Swinehart had fired an arrow. My backup man poured a lot of lead before the 3-ton mass dropped, he recounted. It came within a few yards of us. The incident cost him the $750 he'd paid for the license. He needed to start over to achieve the feat with his bow and nearly his life. And the previous day on the second trip, a rhino had chased Swinehart and his party up a tree before he ever fired a shot. Okay, Almeida replied. We'll give it one more try. Swinehart finally spotted his quarry in a gap among thorn bushes. Here is his recollections from the December 1906 issue of Archery World. He was so big, so was the front horn. His head was slightly turned, with one of his beady eyes glaring at me. I quickly drew an arrow on my 90-pound longbow. On the instant of release, the dark mass of muscle whirled with such amazing agility that he was coming face on when the arrow got there. The steel-tipped fiberglass arrow struck the shoulder area, doing no mortal harm, and the rhino stopped, turned, and began to trot away. Swinehart wrote, the delay was long enough to get off another arrow, which buried deep behind the 4 legs just as the rhino disappeared behind the thorn growth. More loud snorting and crashing, small trees snapping to the ground, and all was deathly still. Slowly trailing, we soon spied his massive form crumpled to the earth like a pile of gray boulders. The successful hunt brought Swinehart notoriety of a sort. Ripley's Believe It or Not noted the accomplishment with one of its iconic pencil drawings. He appeared on national TV on magazine covers. Archery World called him a celebrated figure of world prominence. In one published photograph, Swinehart kneels over the animal, its eyes nestled in a mass of pachyderm wrinkles. His right hand sits almost tenderly on the rhino's head, and his eyes peer off into some middle space. On the same trip, Swinehart bagged a lion in Mozambique, claiming the last of the so-called Big Five. He'd taken an elephant, Cape buffalo, and leopard in 1964, becoming the first archer to accomplish the feat. His exploits entered him into the realm of legend, if mostly of his own creation. In his stories, the natives were primitive but friendly and lacked the strength to pull his bow. His safari was one of the most successful of its kind ever to come out of Africa. He was a star of his own Hemingway novel, only without the understatement. Swinehart parlayed his assault on the world's most charismatic megafauna into a cottage industry. He toured frequently, showing slides from his hunts. Here he was hunched over a dead lion. There he was handing villagers pretzels from a massive Bachmann can. He conducted demonstrations in which he pinged coins with arrows. He started a 2-hour TV show about archery that aired in 1967. In 1970, he published an autobiographical coffee table book, Sagittarius, named for the archer of mythology. In his fables, Swinehart was the god of all his realm. He took extraordinary chances, creeping to within yards of lions and leopards, and when his talent wasn't enough, he also possessed uncanny physical prowess and even luck, like when he outran several buffalo before they cut him off from his vehicles. The only question was what Swinehart might do next, except that just when things seemed like there was nowhere on the planet he could travel to and conquer, he began to lose his way. I don't believe in haunted houses. Houses are collections of wood and nails and glasses and paint. They're incapable of agency or pathos. Spirits don't occupy them any more than they occupy a kitchen table or a lampshade. Haunted houses, of course, are an enduring part of the American zeitgeist, but I've always felt that stories about haunted houses are really stories about haunted people. People are the damaged ones because they are abused or endure trauma or involved in some unfortunate accident. Later, if they fall ill or drink too much or ruin their marriage, they neglect their living space in the same ways, which leads to leaky and rusty and waterlogged homes. These troubled houses, passed on to new owners, now harbor bedeviling defects. Haunted house stories are war stories. Not real war, obviously, but war in the sense that you're struggling against those who came before, whose lives now overlap with yours in a shared experience of living under the same roof. Their decisions and misfortunes sometimes become yours. In the middle of our second night on Pine Street, a big window fell out of its casing and shattered loudly. Not long after that, in the spring, when Anne was poking around on the second floor, she was besieged by a swarm of flying carpenter ants. Sometimes later, a section of the ceiling collapsed in Vaughn's room while he slept. Once we'd installed a natural gas furnace, we hired someone to empty and remove the obsolete 1,000-gallon backyard oil tank. The contractor left the supply line uncapped in the basement. The tank had been pumped dry, after all, except a day later, oil began bubbling up from that line in a small geyser. As we grappled with all of this, we absorbed stories about Bob Swinehart, learned that he had built his identity, and maybe even some of our house, on archery and on the killing of our animals. As omnivores, we're fine with substance hunting, but feeling that trophy hunting is repugnant, it made everything Swinehart touched feel somehow compromised. There were as many peculiar tales about him as there were about the house, the kind that gets told in small towns over generations, larded with embellishments and grotesqueries. Swinehart had become increasingly odd and reclusive over the years. As paranoia set in, he installed the false chimney to surveil the neighborhood. He ruined his marriage, then built himself the apartment upstairs, ordering cement flooring so his estranged wife couldn't shoot at him through her ceiling. We had no idea how much of it was true, but when we dealt with problems in the house, we imagined that we were contending with Swinehart himself. His outsized and maybe somewhat unhinged persona loomed over us, determined to leave its mark. That mark was now our mark, and I would have conversations with him in my mind. Bob, did you really have to build this upstairs like a bomb shelter? Maybe everything was a testament to his inability to recognize his excesses, or maybe there was some deeper pathos. Either way, we sought real world explanations for every instance of would be haunting. The previous owner, another family, lived there between the Swineharts and us, had left that bedroom window unfastened when they switched out the screens. The framing under the roof was rotting and the carpenter ants had long been feasting on it. The long supply line had oil left over in it. We were doing a renovation, not an exorcism. Anne made steady progress. Entirely self-taught, she replaced cedar sidings, removed and replaced windows, installed new flooring, patched drywall, and on and on. She compiled lists to keep tracks of her lists. Vaughn spent the heart of his childhood in a room Anne painted in a motif of rolling green hills and blue sky. We threw footballs and frisbees in the yard, and he and his friends played under the tent like branches of a Japanese maple. We organized scavenger hunts around the property. There were birthday parties and weekend dinner parties and an annual Halloween gathering. When I made a pot of gumbo for friends before trick or treating. Impromptu gatherings bubbled up on the back patio, faces glowing under strings of lights. Anna installed across the eave. 5 buddies came over for monthly poker nights in the basement. Some of our struggles amounted to nothing more than the sad trombone comedy. Late in our first winter there, our hot water heater conked out. We were exasperated and broke and couldn't swing a replacement, so instead we took showers at work and school for several weeks. It was a little like camping, and the dishwasher still worked. Finally, we called a repairman. He came up from the basement with a sheepish grin. An electrical issue had simply knocked the heater off at some point. All we needed to do was hit the reset button. Other issues pushed us closer to what felt like a real abyss. The $5,000 we thought we'd spent to replace the roof doubled when the roofers found rot. We faced an appalling choice: find money now to dig up half the backyard and remove the 55-year-old oil tank, or face a modest environmental disaster later if it leaked. We clawed for financial handholds. My first book came out in 2010, but our income overall fell short of what we needed to cover the renovation and the mortgage. We were caught in a catch 22. An upstairs tenant would help pay for all the house related costs, but without the repairs, no one could live up there. Doubts crept in. We're in over our heads, I would muse as I pushed the lawnmower around. Maybe this time we were caught between who we were and who we believed ourselves to be. But when I worried about going over a cliff, Anne reminded me, haunted houses aren't real. None of us has cancer. No one is dead on a battlefield. It's a house. It's only a house. There was another systemic oddity at Pine Street. Our first summer there, a thunderstorm ripped through and the power guttered, blinked out, and then came back to life after a minute or so. Everything returned to normal except that in the kitchen the light in the breezeway wouldn't come back on. The light had buttons instead of switches because the house ran on a low voltage electrical wiring system that had been fashionable in the 1950s. I pressed the button repeatedly in the pointless way people jab at call buttons for slow moving elevators. When that didn't work, I changed the bulb. Still nothing. About 10 days later, another storm hit, and the power went off for an hour. That night, Anne pressed the button to extinguish the row of recessed lights in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, and nothing happened. Now those lights wouldn't turn off. We looked at each other and shook our heads. We'd seen a lot from Pine Street, but this was new. We were too tired to puzzle through it, so the light stayed on that night. The next day, unable to make any headway, Anne switched off the fuse. Over time, certain lights in different parts of the house continued to misfire in that way. Either they wouldn't turn on or they wouldn't shut off. Finally, we called the only electrician we could find who serviced low voltage electrical systems. We had complicated experiences with servicemen, and fixed, replaced, patched, painted, and caulked, but when problems extended beyond her capabilities, she would invite in the appropriate specialist. Most seemed fascinated by one of a kind features: our stainless steel gutters, our gargantuan leak prone chimney, the oddly sized windows. One roofing guy, after looking the place over, turned to Annie and declared, "My God, this place is a money pit." A Sub-Zero repairman cringed when he saw our ancient refrigerator, saying he'd done all he could for that unit for the previous owner. We resorted to the fridge's final days to stuffing bags of ice in the freezer to help it stay cold, like nurses treating a fevered patient. He beseeched Anne not to call again. After some reconnaissance, the electrician said he couldn't identify the electrical problem without probing further. He offered a choice. He could try to solve the issue at $80 per hour, or he could tear everything out and rewire the house for $8,000. It was an easy call. There was no 8 grand lying around, so he arrived the next morning in sleuth mode. His presence over the next couple of days continually reminded me of how we were perpetually backsliding. One problem solved only to have a bigger one appear. Anne's to-do list seemed to grow no matter how many items she crossed off. It was like the Red Witch told Alice marooned in Wonderland. Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. As we had never been good savers, we always prioritized experiences instead, and so, with no other choice, we started the great American credit shell game, shuffling balances from one credit card to another, low interest accounts to keep us from falling off the back of the treadmill. I focused on two things, working and worrying, to try to cover the gaping crevasses opening in our finances. I started a second book and took freelance jobs. For a time I started working every morning at 5 and didn't stop until 6:30 at night. This helped keep the wheels on, but the cost in other ways was immeasurable. I spent weeks pushing into exhaustion. I felt sour and besieged. At once a victim and a tormentor, quizzing Anne about the upstairs renovation, reminding her about our proximity to the abyss. I mumbled through our declined calls from family and friends, hoping for a friendly catch up. One evening, plummeting towards a low point, I sat down to dinner. Anne had made a pasta dish. As we were about to eat, she noticed she had a fork she didn't like, and since I'd set the table, asked me for another one. This was a thing. She was particular about her cutlery. Normally, we'd bantered about this idiosyncrasy, but this time I snapped. With everything going on, I asked, here we were really in a position to be picky about our flatware. And why wasn't she concerned about anyone else eating with inferior cutlery? I held my own fork and Exhibit A. Did no one happen to inquire whether I was okay with mine? Anne smirked. Like you care, she said. This infuriated me. I'm serious, I said. No one cares, right? I just take whatever. No one bothers to ask. No one bothers, period. I want you to ask me one time which fork I want, once. I was almost shouting, and I was both there and not, looking back. It's like I was hovering over the room at some level aware of the absurdity of what I was doing. Yet in that moment I was willing to die on that hill. A long, painful, elastic silence ensued. I poured myself a third glass of wine. Later that night, Anne pulled me aside. What is with you? She said. Cornering me, I waved her off, disappeared into the folds of our couch. This became a pattern. Me checking out, marinating in my misery, and dropping by to ask if I wanted to connect. She tried to get me to do yoga with her. Let me think about it, I'd say. Code for no. Later, I lay awake alone until the small hours. My headspace, grand opera of imagined catastrophes. I envisioned standing in the driveway next to piles of furniture, orange foreclosure stickers over the front door. I imagined telling Vaughn he would probably have to rely on predatory loans for college. I obsessed over every step in our life journey. How could we have nothing saved at this stage of life? How could we have taken such a reckless gamble? And so we repaired the house but incurred damage elsewhere. I stayed in my tunnel using work as a cudgel and a permanent hall pass. It wasn't that I wanted things to stay broken, I just wasn't sure anymore what could be fixed. Those weirdly fickle light switches, for example. The electrician puzzled for 2 days over our low voltage system. It seemed that the harder he worked to unravel the rogue wiring, the more he found himself at a loss. At the end, he slumped into our kitchen and told Anne that we had the most impenetrable tangle he'd ever seen. She thanked him and paid him for his time, and that was the way Pine Street stayed, with some lights that worked all the time and others not at all. We were a house divided and permanently darkened. I still didn't blame Pine Street, though. No haunted houses, only haunted people. The problem was I was becoming one of them. In 1970, around the time he published Sagittarius, Bob Swinehart took over as president of his father-in-law's construction company, building homes around the valley. He continued with his exhibitions, and readers of local newspapers and archery magazines awaited stories from his next adventures, but none came. This may have been partly due to Swinehart's newfound responsibilities. There was more to it, though. He and June split, and he moved to the second floor apartment with his dedicated entrance. Friends noticed that the irresponsible natural showman seemed moody, isolated, and volatile. Swinehart avoided hanging around camp with his hunting companion after they'd finished for the day. He preferred to go off and sleep alone in the bush. In 1974, the local paper ran an auction notice. He was unloading many of his things, including his 1949 Rolls-Royce Bentley, spears, ostrich eggs, and a real elephant foot bar stool. The house with all its eccentricities would soon be occupied by someone else. Swinehart kept only his most prized possession from his hunts, his collection of taxidermied animal heads, tusks, skins, and artifacts from his 8 safaris, which he would store with family in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. He and a new fiancée, Catherine, were heading deep into the jungle of Gabon to study gorillas for the yet to be determined future. If Swinehart felt ambivalent about liquidating his trophy life, he didn't let on during an interview with a local newspaper reporter. For the first time in my life, he said, I can totally forget everything and do what I want. Little went as planned. Swinehart returned after a year or two in Africa and was feted at a 1977 event held by a local bow hunters club. He and Catherine had two children, but their marriage soon began to come undone. There were no further articles about archery in Africa. Swinehart eventually landed in Ohio working for a tree company. Eventually, he moved back east to Pottstown, suffering from what Police Chief James Rogers later described as mental health problems. On a frigid day in January 1982, he received shattering news. His brother Dave, a successful real estate developer in Pottstown, had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death outside the home of his estranged wife, Patty. Bob vowed to track down the killer, but the truth took nearly a decade to untangle. Police would allege that Patty had conspired with Thomas and Jeffrey de Blase, her nephews through marriage, to kill her husband so she could collect more than $500,000 in life insurance. The de Blase brothers were convicted of murder, but Patty was acquitted in 1994. Just after the murder, Bob Swinehart's sister Karen checked him into Philadelphia Veteran Hospital for an indefinite stay. 4 months later, he left the hospital on his first furlough. He asked his mother, Viola, to bring him to the Swinehart building in Pottstown, one of his late brother's properties. It was a Monday afternoon, May 10th, 1982. Swinehart, then 54 years old, said he wanted to look over personal belongings he stored there. It seemed like a natural thing, mourning and processing his brother's loss by sifting through the artifacts of his life. Maybe Swinehart was trying to find his way back to himself. But when he didn't return after a while, Viola grew worried and asked for help. The search ended quickly. Back at the Swinehart building, he had located among his possessions his .243 caliber hunting rifle. As Swinehart had done so many times during his adventures, the legendary hunter had hefted his weapon, steadied it, and one last time fired. Once again, his aim was deadly accurate. As the years passed, we invited friends to stay upstairs in exchange for help fixing the space. Ray erected a few walls and installed insulation and drywall. Joe rebuilt and tiled the kitchen and bathroom, among other foundational improvements. Having the second floor occupied for the first time made me think more about Swinehart, made me wonder what kind of guy builds a house like this. I began asking around. One of Swinehart's old friends, Wilmer Schultz, told of traveling to Chicago with Bobby, partying with him, having dinner as a foursome with their wives. He knew of Swinehart's precipitous descent. I think he went berserk, Schultz said. In the last couple of years, he wasn't the same Bob Swinehart I knew when Evelyn and I used to go down there. But when I pressed for an explanation, Schultz demurred, saying they'd drifted apart by then. I read Sagittarius with its hagiographic narratives and cartoonish ethnographies, and I dug up articles Swinehart had written. I wanted to know not just the particulars of what he did, but why. It seemed important in a way I couldn't identify. Maybe partly it was a realization, as I learned more about him, that in certain ways he and I were eerily alike. Swinehart was a travel writer. I had been one too. We both had outdoors oriented childhoods. Both loved hiking and camping. We were virtually the same age, around 42, when our first books were published, and we were both in our 40s and living on Pine Street when our lives started to fray. Was he disappointed that his writing career fizzled after Sagittarius? Did his obsession derail his life? Did his trophy house become his anchor? Maybe if I understood everything about him, I could avoid his fate. Maybe by telling his story, I could objectify my own, pull it outside myself so I could study it and illuminate larger truths about what was happening, about what I was doing, and why. My own precarious descent came at a steep cost. Anne and I were becoming increasingly distant. She could understand how I had become so dark, so work obsessed, and she took it as rejection. We began to face the fact that we were no longer a team in the same way, that the house had formed a wedge between us. On a hike one wintry day, Anne told me she didn't know if she wanted to be married to someone who was so obsessed about work and the house, at the expense of everything else. I shrugged and said, if that's the way you feel, well then. One day, two men stopped in. Deano Farkas was a hunter who had admired Swinehart throughout his life. Lawson Heckman was one of Bob's old friends. They wanted to run a metal detector around the backyard, look for coins Swinehart had used for target practice. Toward the end of the visit, Heckman mentioned that Bob had seemed haunted. He said Swinehart had confided in him about his Korean War service, that at one point Bob was given the harrowing task of repatriating battlefield casualties. In winter, that meant collecting bodies that were frozen as they'd fallen. As a cracker, he sometimes had to snap them out of hunched positions to load them, Heckman recalled. This wasn't all. Heckman also said Swinehart had been questioned in David Swinehart's murder because allegedly the brothers had engaged in some sort of dispute over a piece of land prior to the killing. The police, according to the story Heckman says Swinehart told him, had taken Bobbin for several lengthy interrogations, including one that lasted a full night. A few years later, I spoke to Swinehart's daughter, Lisa Wida, who said that her father had suffered from bipolar disorder. This may have explained Swinehart's boundless energy and insatiable hunger for adventure, and also his struggles with paranoia and despondency, which would grow so profound, she said, that he was at times unable to take basic care of himself. The condition remained undiagnosed for years, and even after doctors identified his illness, the conquering hunter would neither own up his suffering nor accept treatment. We knew he needed help, White said, but he refused to go to a doctor. It seemed that even the people close to Swinehart couldn't agree on his undoing. The blunt force trauma of war, the devastating aftermath of his brother's murder, an untreated mental illness, any one of those things could have dragged him toward an abyss. In combination, they may have conspired to nudge him over the edge. Nearly 40 years on, we may never know the full truth. The swirling mystery surrounding his death formed an apt coda to a life that, even while he embraced a kind of minor celebrity, was largely hidden from view. His greatest passion and escape was hunting, but with all his demons, actual inherited and imagined, baying at his heels, he might have felt as if he was the one being stalked. In autumn of 2018, we put the house up for sale. We were weary of doing battle with it, each in our own way, and we wanted to return to more of an urban setting. That was part of the story, at least. Anne later said she wanted to get rid of the house so that we might take one last stab at finding our way back to each other. She sealed off the miniature doors so that the place didn't seem quite as strange, and disassembled the ladder to the false chimney. The hatch and panic room were no longer accessible. The new owners closed on the house almost 9 years to the day after we bought it. It's funny what you get used to. All you can do is live in the space you have in the time you have, navigating the obstacles you encounter. Every night going to bed, I negotiated that hallway where we turned off the circuit breaker, plunging it into permanent darkness. Sometimes I'd use my phone to illuminate the way, but often I just grope along the walls, around the corner, and through the doorway, occasionally tripping over a stray shoe or a dog toy, but otherwise relying on my brain's mapping. In many ways, years later, I'm still feeling my way along. Roughly 1,300 people gathered in Indianapolis in January 2000 to honor that year's inductees into the Archery Hall of Fame. The 50th person to be enshrined 18 years after his death was Bob Swinehart. AHF President David Staples told Swinehart's hometown newspaper that the induction was long overdue. He had a Sagittarius, took archery out of the cornfield, and made it global. In the audience were 19 members of Swinehart clan, including 5 of his 6 children. I remember Daddy shooting in the backyard a lot, not because he had to practice, but because he so loved shooting the bow. His daughter Lisa told the assemblage, "My father left us all with a love of wildlife, adventure, and the outdoors." The complexities of his life and his suicide went unaddressed. The irony that a man who consistently dodged death while hunting couldn't survive himself, couldn't flee the darkness that stalked his mind. Instead, the hall and the people there embraced Swinehart's legacy as a trailblazer and storyteller, a man who was unafraid to risk everything to chase a kind of immortality. Maybe finally, all those years later, he'd reach the place he always was trying to go. We moved to a city hundreds of miles away where the air is salty and the winters are long, and rented a place where someone else fixes the furnace when it conks out. But we couldn't escape the oppressive shadow of the house, and eventually last year Anne and I split up. In many ways, both literal and metaphorical, we've moved on. But I still go back to Pine Street in my mind. There's no limit to what I'll do when I'm there, because finally all the work is done. Sometimes I'll stand by the above ground pool in the backyard that 6-year-old Vaughn loves to flop into. He'll pop up with his red hair plastered around his glowing freckled face. "Dad!" He'll yell, "Jump in!" After that, we'll throw a football around the spirals dropping effortlessly into his hands as he glides past the big maple. When we're all done, I'll sit out back with Anne, sipping a glass of wine, admiring the way she spruced up the patio. We'd be bathed in the late afternoon light that washes over Pennsylvania towards the end of summer, when the world seems to be made of molten gold and spun cotton, and soon friends from around town will drift and join us. Sam will make a toast and Jeremy will tell a funny story that has everyone doubled over. We'll stay up most of the night, eating and talking, reveling in the company and the fullness of our lives, the chatter and laughter bouncing back to us off the thick walls, and the glow from strings of lights forming a protective circle until everyone finally drifts away home in the gray of pre-dawn. Somewhere in there, I'll put my hand on Anne's shoulder and she'll look up at me, then nodding toward the table in front of us and the trees and grass and fence beyond, she'll say, "This was such a good idea." Well, come back soon because there's a lot more eerie stuff going on that I have to tell you about. Till next time.